Hello and welcome back to this damn fully dualistic crusade. This video is a review of the Eureka Entertainment Region B Blu-ray release of three lesser known and lesser discussed Universal horror or Universal horror adjacent, or sometimes period or science fiction, films from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. These are all part of the overall Universal horror canon that frequently is not discussed and overlooked because people only think of Universal horror in regards to what are termed the Universal monsters. So there are many more films outside of the realm of just the monster characters, and some are debatably and very obviously not horror films, but they were routinely packaged enough times over the decades with the horror films, starting with the famous shock theater package in the 1950s, that they kind of became part and parcel of the overall Universal horror canon. And it's still debated among critics, scholars, and fans, where does Universal horror exactly end, and how do you define the eras and such. But the overall horror cycle went through several different eras, starting with 1931's Dracula and Frankenstein, all the way up until at least arguably the start of the 1950s Universal science fiction films that really took off with 1953's It Came from Outer Space for Universal. But there are other films in the sci-fi period that also are sometimes considered part of the Universal horror canon, so you could stretch it all the way to perhaps the early 1960s and the end of Universal science fiction films, and possibly even tying in Hitchcock's Psycho as well. So there's a lot of debate that rages, but there are a great number of really interesting films that are in this sort of banner that never get discussed outside of genre circles and books on the Universal cycles, and they remain fascinating. So it's great to see them finally get some love and attention on a physical media release with new supplements and new scans, and or at least spipped up masters, as opposed to how they turned up on DVD. These have been turning up on the Shout Factory Universal horror volumes. Those are unfortunately a bit overpriced, and while they do have some really nice exclusive new commentaries that are very tempting, for the most part, when Eureka does a release of the same films, they do honestly a much better themed package. So they've been doing these theme packages of 3 and 4 films, and I've covered some of them before. They also did the amazing Karloff at Columbia set, which includes his masterful performance in the must-see The Black Room, along with his Mad Doctor cycle of films that are enormous fun. So they've been doing a lot of classic horror releases, but they've also been sort of double dipping what Shout Factor did in their Universal volumes, but where the Shout volumes were just, I mean, there is a sort of loose theme to some of them, but otherwise they seem rather randomized. Eureka has at least taken various Universal horror or horror adjacent films and put them into themed packages. Now, my only issue with both of these types of release is I've always hoped there would be a chronological set of the films, really the entire Universal horror canon and all of these films that are horror adjacent. Unfortunately, that's probably never going to happen, but it's wishful thinking. But at least if you're not going to go chronologically in volumes, at least Eureka here has a dedicated theme per set, so it makes sense why they put certain films together. Although again, I wish they were just being done chronologically, and in spite of having nice themes, there are some films, like I'll discuss here, that really go together, but now they're on separate sets. But again, I can't really fault Eureka, because at least they're trying to create a theme set, but that is something of note. So if you're a big Universal horror fan, you're going to have to get all of these, whether you go for the Shout versions or the Eureka versions. But of the two, the Eureka sets are the better all around. They have more extensive supplements usually, they have better packaging, better theme packages of which films they group together, and are better made and better encoded, and significantly cheaper even importing from the UK or buying from a specialty retailer here than what you'd have to pay for one of the Shout sets, even when it's on sale. That's how overpriced those are. So that's why I've gone for the Eureka sets. And Someday I'd like to pick up the Shout sets because there's some titles they've done that Eureka hasn't done yet, but I'm assuming they're going to get around to those. But also the Shout sets have some really great exclusive commentaries that Eureka couldn't relicense, but then again, Eureka had their own made. So you're not losing out on the commentary front. But if you're a completist and you want to hear all the thoughts of the usual great horror historians, you will have to essentially get both releases of the same films and same masters. But if you're just trying to think with your wallet, I think the Eureka is the much better option for all of these. So with that out of the way, I'm going to do some reviews of certain of these sets, and the first is Universal Terror. This is bringing together 3 films that are obviously featuring or starring Boris Karloff, who was the breakout horror star after Frankenstein, and Universal built him up to, of course, be billed by his last name only, or Karloff the Uncanny. And the first film we'll discuss here in this set is apparently the last time he was actually billed with just the Karloff surname, and that's 1937's Night Key. And this is one of those films that's definitely, it's not a horror film, but it's been packaged with the horror films for so long, and it's a Karloff vehicle from 1937 that, you know, it kind of feels part and parcel with the canon of Universal horror films that are not horror films and kind of border a little tiny bit on science fiction, but it's also akin to Karloff's Mad Doctor films. This is a couple years before he would start doing those for Columbia, and here he plays a sort of doddering old absent-minded professor, except here he's a very kindly character with bad eyesight who is very lovable and pitiable, who has been taken advantage of by unscrupulous business partners and has spent the rest of his life trying to perfect his next invention, which is a superior security system. Unfortunately, Karloff's character here is so pitiable that he makes the very dumb choice to go back to the guy who ripped him off in the past and stole his life's work, who is the head of a security company now, played by Samuel S. Hines, who stole Karloff's character's work for the security system and used that to build his giant company that he's trumpeting around the city. And so Karloff's character of Mallory is also led astray by his very wonderfully scheming lawyer in a tiny bit part by the always great Edwin Maxwell, into essentially signing over his new system and only getting a pittance for it. So once again, he's been ripped off again by the same person because he stupidly went back to the same person, but that's neither here nor there. So then Karloff's character of Mallory then decides to use his invention of a particular sort of master key of sorts, because of course he designed the system that is being used everywhere. He is now going to enact a plan of revenge that involves basically breaking into places and wreaking havoc and making the security system look bad and getting his revenge that way. And it's actually a fun plot idea because, of course, the Mallory character is not interested in larceny or criminal activities. He just wants to screw over the person that has now screwed him over twice and essentially ruined his life. So he breaks into places, and we have all kinds of fun bits of he is just basically messing with stores and moving things around and different things, but not stealing anything. This is sparked and convoluted further by the criminal character that Mallory runs into, the wonderfully charming Petty Louie, played by Hobart Cavanaugh, who practically steals giant chunks of this film, who is this wonderful, happy-go-lucky, small-time thief who assists the Mallory character, and every time they go into a place, he's always trying to pocket stuff, and Mallory has to say, "No, put that back." "Oh, just a few tickets, just a few tickets," and he has to put back all the pocket watches he's just dumped in his pocket. So there's a wonderful charm in this film that is also reflected in the rest of the cast, particularly as you see in most films like this where Karloff is playing an older character. There's usually a daughter somewhere, not to mention a dead wife. You got both of those here, but here the daughter is played by the wonderful Jean Rogers after she had done the first 2 Immortal Flash Gordon serials. And while she's not given a whole lot to do, she's more of just the worrying daughter type, she is actually let in on the plot and knows what her father's up to and is constantly worrying about him and is, of course, mad as hell that he's been ripped off yet again. And she has great energy and is adorable in this film and has great chemistry with Karloff. So it's nice to see her get a chance to shine here, but also it's always great when you have the sort of token daughter role actually being played with some vigor and some grit, and you can tell that these characters have not had the easiest time of it, but she's just a wonderful addition to this film that gives it a further charm and energy. There is also a romantic subplot with with an interesting sort of meet cute scenario as well, because Warren Hull plays the sort of young lead and love interest of the Gene Rogers character. He works as a security guard for the company run by the Samuel Hines character, and is sort of put on the task of following the daughter of Mallory around everywhere. And rather interestingly and oddly, they seemingly overstep their legal bounds everywhere, because their meet cute is literally him and another guard just sort of bursting into their apartment and looking for her father, who's run off, and then he literally camps outside in the hallway and sleeps on the floor. That's their meet cute. And eventually he sort of starts to see the error of his ways, and their relationship develops. And Warren Hull has lovely energy here and is very likable, and the sort of interesting way to meet somebody of literally following them everywhere for days on end and being an annoyance is done in a way that is actually kind of charming, and they do have a meet cute, and that whole subplot is actually reasonably developed. And all of this is surprising because the film is just barely over an hour. But the plot gets even more complicated because, of course, the biggest gangster in town decides he wants in on this special ability of the mysterious Night Key, who's breaking into all these places, but apparently not stealing anything, when he has the ability to get past the great security system. So, of course, the Mallory character is then kidnapped and forced to do the bidding of said gangster, who is known as the Kid and played by Alan Baxter, who is quite good in this film. He's very soft-spoken, very quiet, but extraordinarily menacing. This was just a couple years before he would play what I think is probably his best role, his most memorable role, as the killer and secret German agent in Hitchcock's Saboteur, where he is also very similarly extremely soft-spoken, but is unbelievably menacing, and really injects energy into a role that in and of itself would be very simple. And in Saboteur, he has, I think, one of the great little villain monologues in all of Hitchcock's canon, talking about his childhood and about just the menace he puts, and the way he describes how his hair was very long and had these long golden curls as a child. I mean, he just puts so much menace in just the simplest dialogue, and you get that here, but here he's playing a gangster. So it's a nice, slightly different spin on what could be a very stereotypical character. And amusingly, rather interestingly, his chief henchman, Fingers, is played by Ward Bond. So the cast is stacked with familiar faces and character actors, and that helps to elevate everything even further. The film was directed by Lloyd Corrigan, who was probably more famous as an actor, but he did direct this film among a good number of others, and while I haven't seen all of them, this one is certainly my favorite of the ones I have seen. And the film did go through a little bit of a shaky production. They seemed to not know how to exactly work out the script elements, and the ending was in question, and they did have a director change, so Corrigan was not the first director, and the film did go a little bit over budget and over schedule by the end of it. However, this is just a remarkable little film. I've loved it since the first time I saw it. It's a little treasure in the sort of Universal horror adjacent canon, and it's quite surprising that the film is as effective as it is, because it only runs 68 minutes, so it's barely over an hour, and it has enough plot really to be at least 90 minutes, if not a 2-hour film. But because it's so short, it has a B-movie energy. It moves at a good clip. All the performances have energy and sparkle to them, and in particular, some really nice standouts that I've already highlighted. This is topped off by a great Karloff performance. He is fully invested here, and this is one of his most lovable, doddering old men performances. He's got the white hair and the thick glasses, and he's as a character is going blind, so when he doesn't have his glasses, he's sort of staggering around, but he's so lovable, and there's such charm to this this film, and especially all the scenes with Mallory and Petty Louie going around and interacting, and all the wonderful bits of business when they break into places and just like they break into one store and just move all the clocks around, and then another one where they break into an umbrella shop and just leave all the umbrellas open and then go out the front door. So there's a lot of charm in this film. There's a lot of energy. It never overstays its welcome, and it's just a delight. It's one of the little treasures of digging into the Universal horror adjacent films that just doesn't get talked about. It's a little treasure. No, it's not perfect. Yes, it's obviously a B film. Yes, it's only 67 minutes, but it's just so much damn fun, and the cast is far above average in terms of what you would expect from a film like this. So for me, this is one of the treasures of the outside the regular Universal horror canon films, and I'm so happy it finally has the new scan and master here, and it looks and sounds much better than it did on the old DVD, and now people will be able to experience the just sheer fun of Night Key in a lovely Blu-ray presentation. Now, in terms of the picture quality, this is a newer Universal master. They've been quietly going back and doing new scans and at least doing newer preservation masters of their horror adjacent films. That's what's being used for the Shout and Eureka sets. Not all of them are brand new scans. Some are basically HD masters spiffed up from the old DVD master, or some are literally the DVD master, but then others are credited as a new 2K scan. So basically with all of these, expect a good baseline of quality, with some being merely slightly better than their DVD counterparts because now they're in 1080p, and then others being big steps forward because it's a new scan and of course of much greater detail and clarity than the old DVD master. But none of them have been meticulously restored, so you do need to expect general wear to pop up. Some are going to be a bit dirtier than others due to how many times they were reissued, how popular they were. And here in Night Key, there is unfortunately quite a bit of inherent marks and damage. Nothing major, and it's, you know, obviously what you would expect from a film that did have a number of reissues from 1937, and it's very similar to what you see on the DVD, which also had issues of its own in terms of it being a worn element. So there are some scratches and marks that appear occasionally, a fleeting line or two. There are one or two very minor spots where it looks like there's a frame missing. Notice one or two of those, and then one tiny spot where there's a little bit of frame movement, or like a jump in the frame. But all this stuff seems to be inherent to the element. You can also tell this film did get reissues because unfortunately the opening has the Real Art reissue title card, and Real Art was the company that bought up the rights to Universal films and did repackage reissues for a lot of them, and that's why a lot of the materials that survive, and usually the only trailers that survive for Universal horror films, if you look, they are the Real Art reissue trailers or the Real Art reissue posters or lobby cards things. So here apparently the source for Night Key they have literally is somehow tied to the Real Art reissue version, because that's literally the title card they have. Of course, the end card is also the Real Art card, so it's got Real Art opening and closing information, and also the trailer in the extras is the Real Art trailer, so that figures. But overall, this is a nice, healthy presentation. It is a big jump forward over the DVD, obviously, and it seems to be pretty much the same source. So expect there is going to be some wear and damage because of the wear of time and reissues and things, but it looks quite remarkable here, I must admit. It was a real treat to see this in high definition. One last thing about the picture quality, because it's now in HD and you're looking at this in 2023, it does make the transitions a bit more noticeable, because when we have a transition, we obviously go to dupe footage and it's an optical effect and the quality is lesser, and then you have that sort of pop-in effect. And some of the transitions are a little bit dirty and don't look quite as good as probably they did originally. Also, there are one or two optical effects, courtesy of the legendary John P. Fulton, that are obviously a bit softer. Those are pretty much in the climax, but just due to how the optical shot was done, that's why those bits look a little bit softer, but you know, obviously that makes sense. On the audio side of things, we have the original mono mix and lossless quality. Here it sounds pretty much how I remember the DVD sounding. It's got at least a good amount of natural hiss still left, but it does have source limitations. There is some occasional distortion and harshness and things, but it sounds overall healthy and pretty much similar to what was on the DVD. So I think pretty much all of these are going to be reusing the same elements, whether it's a new scan or not, and the audio pretty much follows suit. But here we get it in lossless quality this time, as opposed to lossy Dolby Digital on the DVD. Then for the supplements, all three films have the same sort of package. We get a new commentary, we get a rather extensive stills gallery that's broken up into two sections, and then we get any surviving trailers. So for Night Key, we have a brand new commentary with the always wonderful Jonathan Rigby and Kevin Lyons. They form a wonderful double act and do yet another fantastic commentary like they've done for many classic horror films and Hammer horror films as well. And they are similarly delighted by coming back to this film, as I think everybody is. And they get into the nitty-gritty of the production and some of the production issues that I mentioned that sort of changed the ending, which went through a bunch of different variations. And they give a lot of great cast and crew biographical background and talk about where Karloff was at this point in his career and how Night Key is also very much coming as a precursor to the Columbia Mad Doctor films. And it's just a wonderful track, and also even more amazing because they have to cram all this in only 68 minutes of runtime. So it's another great commentary and worth purchasing this set for. The stills gallery on these releases is also well done. Again, it's split into two, and you get a lot of really nice production stills, in addition to also getting a lot of the posters and foreign release posters, which are fascinating, in addition to some lobby cards. And rather amusingly, where they can get it, they even include some of the original or older 80s and 90s VHS home video release artwork. And that's really nice and fascinating to see, and definitely gives me that sort of flash of nostalgia when I see that included. And it's not something you usually see in a stills gallery on a disc, so that's nice when they include the home video past. Then you get to the trailer, which again is the Real Art reissue trailer. But unfortunately, not only is this standard def, but it seems like the copy they were given to use is really of poor quality. It's got a lot of it's like it's an old standard def file that was interlaced and not encoded correctly because it's just full of artifacts and it's also upscaled now to 1080p, and it just looks really bad. It's full of artifacts and noise and all kinds of yuckiness. So unfortunately, while the trailer is here and it's only the Real Art reissue trailer, it does look rather poor because apparently Eureka was given a really crappily made encoded upscale of an old standard def scan of the old Real Art trailer. But at least it is here. But do be forewarned, if you're a trailer geek like I am, you're going to click on this on the menu and then be like, whoa, what is going on? So that's really the only thing I could say against this set, is that somebody gave Eureka a really poorly encoded copy of the standard def trailer for Night Key. So that's unfortunate, but at least there is a version of the trailer here, so that's at least nice to still have included. But it was just they should have been given a proper copy of said trailer. Then we move to the second film of the set, which is 1944's The Climax, which was produced and directed by George Wagner and stars Boris Karloff in what is basically the follow-up to the 1943 Technicolor remake Universal had done of The Phantom of the Opera. It was originally devised as the sequel they were planning, and then they decided to base this off of a 1909 stage play also called The Climax, which while it deals with singing, it really has nothing to do with Phantom, and is a very old-fashioned type of story. It is also about men who covet and desire a female character so badly that they feel the need to control them, and it's the actual plot idea is very, very old-fashioned, and the film does try to make this work and does do some interesting things, but it does not have a good reputation. It is usually reviled among classic horror fans for not really having horror content and feeling very slow and laborious, and you can definitely tell this is trying to follow up the 1943 Phantom remake, because you even have George Wagner not only producing this but also directing it this time. But interestingly, it was primarily written by Kurt Siodmak, who became the sort of head scribe of Universal Horror, especially after the success of The Wolfman. But for all the bad stuff you hear about this film and the reputation it has, it's quite interesting. It is plainly obvious was supposed to be Phantom of the Opera Part 2. It is beautifully photographed in Technicolor. They did once again use the Phantom of the Opera stage set from the original 1925 masterwork. But honestly, even though it does move very slowly and the plot revolves around innumerable coincidences and characters suddenly acting dumber than a bag of rocks, it manages to still work. And in some ways, it's actually more consistent in tone than what you see in the 1943 Phantom. Again, we have Susanna Foster in the lead role, essentially playing a version of her Christine from the 1943 Phantom, and she is a young and up-and-coming singing star, and she has her wonderfully handsome, suave love interest, but here he's played by Turin Bay, who is ridiculously charming in what is pretty much a sort of nothing role, and a type of role that a lot of studios would sort of typecast him in. But he has great chemistry with Foster on screen, and there's just something about him in this film that is so unbelievably charming. He has such an enthusiasm that comes across here. And of course, he looks wonderful in all of the extremely detailed costumes, as Foster does. And the actual design of the film is quite extensive, again, just like the 1943 Phantom. But I just really love what Turin Bay does in this film, and I think that it's actually another of the improvements that the Climax has over the 1943 Phantom. We don't have as much of the just random bits of comedy that are inserted, and while those are fine in the 43 Phantom, they do stick out like a sore thumb because they don't fit in the story. And also, the Climax, while it does have a number of obviously stage and opera and singing scenes, they don't stop the film as dead and cold as the 1943 Phantom does, which a lot of horror fans complain has too many opera numbers, and those really do stop the film cold, and also beef up the running time and stretch things out. Here in the Climax, they're not as much of a factor, and so the film actually flows better. So there are elements of this film that are an improvement. And here we also have more to do with our big horror name in terms of Karloff's character being more front and center than what we saw with Claude Rains being so woefully underutilized in the 1943 Phantom, which did a complete reworking of the story. So they make a fascinating comparison, and I think that you have to look at both films together. But I think the Climax has gotten such a bad rap for so long that most people don't really bother with it, and then when they do, they sort of go in knowing all that and not taking a fresh look at the film. And Karloff does some interesting things here. The actual plot is obviously changed quite a bit from the source play, but also the core ideas are still there. But we open with a sort of flashback sequence where Karloff remembers his great love was this singing star, and he wanted her all for himself. And we see a rather nicely done scene where he's flashing back to the moment where he killed her in a fit of rage, and how this has haunted him for the rest of his existence. And now he's a sort of shell of a man, but also the doctor for the opera house. And of course, we are going to have someone remind him of his past love that still haunts him to this day. And so he feels he must control her as well, because he will not be haunted by this voice once again. And of course, that person happens to be the young, beautiful singer played by Susanna Foster. So this is where we get into the core of the story that comes from the original play, where you have the doctor figure trying to control and keep the singer from singing, and here he uses a rather cliched version of hypnosis to try to hypnotize her from ever singing again. but it's the way Karloff plays these scenes, and that combined with the beautiful production design and the lovely usage of Technicolor photography that does add a slight eeriness, and it's Karloff's passion in the role and his just extreme drive to try and control the spirits that are tormenting him, and of course his own guilt, that make the film interesting. In a lot of ways, you can see echoes of the type of character Vincent Price would eventually become synonymous with in horror films. And this really becomes apparent in what is easily the best thing in the film when, after a certain point, Karloff goes to a secret chamber inside of his little mansion house, which is literally on the city street set that was constructed for the 1943 Phantom, so they're just reusing all the stuff. But here he's got a secret chamber where, of course, he has actually preserved the corpse of his love that he murdered many years ago, and apparently he goes in here at night and just talks to the corpse and perhaps does other things. So they very quickly cut these scenes in terms of how long the shots run, but it's a fascinating element that unfortunately is not fully realized, and you can't help but think of Vincent Price and some of the Corman Poe films, for example, in the years to come. So anytime you have the sort of dead loved one idea, and with sort of a tinge of Edgar Allan Poe, you can see the sort of the line going from Karloff here in the climax, drawing all the way to the kinds of roles that Vincent Price would play. So there are fascinating bits here, and there are a lot of familiar character actors you'll recognize, and some nice bits of business, and one or two suspense set pieces that actually work pretty well. But again, the plot does revolve around characters making boneheaded decisions or a lot of coincidences, so there are some moments where you do groan a little bit, and it does run a little long because the pacing feels slow, but the runtime's actually not that terribly long. I think George Wagner does a good job at directing the film and keeping it tonally consistent, outside of maybe one song number that just feels not period appropriate and kind of weird that it's there. But the film actually, I think, kind of works, and this is kind of echoed in the commentary as well. You'll never be able to look at this on its own without thinking of the 1943 Phantom, because they're pretty much joined at the hip, and Universal just did this and poured money into it and tried to make it into a prestige film instead of making a Phantom sequel, which was their original plan. So yes, it's always going to be linked to the Phantom of the Opera remake. Yes, it is a bit stodgy. Yes, there is not really a horror content to it. And yes, people are right to make complaints and have issues with the film. But it actually manages to work. And I think all of that is down to the atmosphere, the direction, the Technicolor photography, some of the performances, and having Karloff at least get some meaty scenes. And I think it's better structured than the 1943 Phantom, and I don't think it has a lot of the same issues. So I think it's able to shake off some of the baggage that the 1943 Phantom had, but it also has some of the same issues and does feel a bit long because the pacing is rather slow. But I don't think it's the terrible film that people make it out to be. There's a lot of stuff to admire here, and I think it's a fascinating film to study, which is made all the better by finally being able to look at it in this HD rendering, which is quite substantially better than the old DVD. Now, this has not been meticulously restored, but it has been cleaned up at least somewhat. So this is a rather nice looking Technicolor presentation, and you get all the wondrous, handsome values of pure 3-strip Technicolor from the golden days of 3-strip Technicolor. It was photographed primarily by the same team behind the 1943 Phantom, and so you have Hal Moore, who won the Oscar for cinematography for Phantom, coming back and shooting this film also in Technicolor, also on a lot of the same sets with some of the same crew. but it's a bit more somber. It's not as bright as the 43 Phantom, and I think it has a visual identity of its own. And I like that it has a somber, darker quality to it. It also helps to make the sets look a bit different when they're reusing some of the same sets, obviously. So in ways, I actually prefer the darker, more somber look of the Climax to what's in the 1943 Phantom in terms of how the Technicolor is handled. And it does look quite beautiful on this transfer. It is far better than how I last saw this film on DVD, and I think the overall black levels and the color depth is better realized here in 1080p, but you will need to expect seeing some occasional bits of damage, some frame wobble, line scratches, spots, and speckles, and because it's Technicolor, usually anytime you have a spot or a mark or something, it's going through one of the color layers, so instead of it just being a white or a black speck, it's what would be usually usually a green little speck. So it makes it a bit more noticeable when it's in color because you've got 3-step Technicolor, and anytime you have a mark or something, it's usually green or red or blue or it's got some color to it. It makes it just stand out more. This also means that some of the lines are sometimes blue, and there are 1 or 2 hairs that pop up on the frame edges, and those usually have a color cast to them as well, usually red or blue or something. So anytime you're looking at a Technicolor film, usually print defects and things will just stand out a little bit more because usually they're in color and they do stick out more from the beauty of the Technicolor visuals. Also, there is a little bit of frame movement here and there are some sections that do look a little soft, especially when you've got the handful of matte shots in the film, which are quite well done. There's a really well done one of the city street with the buildings in the background and the skyline. That's a well done matte shot, and of course those will naturally be a bit softer, but there are a couple spots where there is some softness. So I think this film would really benefit from getting the full 4K treatment like the 1943 Phantom did. I think it could really look stunning, but of course, it's the Climax. It's not going to be a big seller for Universal, so I don't think they can justify the cost of doing a 4K restoration and new master like they did for the Phantom remake, but it would really be something to see. It looks great here. It looks better than the DVD, but one can only imagine seeing the benefits that Phantom got on its 4K master here with the Climax, which is the sister film to the 43 Phantom. The audio here is the original mono mix in lossless quality. It sounds good and has some natural hiss to it, and also like the 43 Phantom, you've got all of the singing sequences with Susanna Foster hitting her famous high notes at times, so this is a much harder film to handle being a vintage mono track because you've got all of the singing sequences. You have to worry about the high notes being too harsh or sounding off or being cut off and things. So like the 43 Phantom, this is one of those films where the original audio track is has to be more closely looked at because you didn't really have a lot of films where you had somebody hitting ridiculously high notes in singing sections. But it does sound good, and the singing sections do sound good, and I think it sounds pretty much like how I remember the DVD sounding when I last watched this film on DVD years ago. So there is some damage in the track, there is some noise and things, and you do have seemingly the original noise floor still there, although I'm sure they did some work on it like Universal always does with any of these films, but nowhere near the overzealous noise reduction that they usually do on the big name horror titles, which is why I think those films have compromised audio. But here this sounds relatively healthy and pretty much how I remember the old DVD sounding, but do expect some inherent defects, and of course it's a 1944 mono track that they're probably having to source from another element or an optical track because there is occasionally some harshness in the dialogue and you hear some noise and things, so I don't think they're coming from the original master source either. Moving on to the supplements, again, we have a brand new commentary by Kevin Lyons and Jonathan Rigby. They do a great discussion of the film. They similarly, like I feel, find there are positives here, and some things are improved over the 43 Phantom, and while it does shake off some of the baggage of that film, it does carry quite a bit of it as well, and is very much the sister film because it started out as the planned sequel, so you can't really look at one without the other. They do a lot of biographical discussion about the cast and crew, about the production, again, where this came in Karloff's career and how he was aging into his sort of next era of his career. and also how this does have some horror tinges, but obviously it does not have a very good reputation. So they do a good job in trying to overturn some of that, and also some great discussion about the original source play and how that was chosen and got transformed into this film, which carries the same title and has recognizable plot beats, but is otherwise very different and basically a Phantom follow-up. Then we again have a lovely stills gallery with a variety of production images, poster images, lobby cards, and even some of the home video releases, which is nice. We also have the film's trailer, which is in standard def and looks pretty solid, but there is some aliasing on the letters of the titles because it's an old standard def copy that Universal obviously provided them. But you can also see how more like what a print would look like, because the color is quite a bit flatter here in this trailer. And of course, it's an old trailer, and those were not exactly accurate, and this is a very flat-looking old standard def trailer, but you can get a sense of how the original prints probably had some color variations, and I think that's always fascinating to see with vintage Technicolor films. So overall, I think the Climax is, it does have some fascinating elements. I think Karloff is very good in the film. I think Susanna Foster is good, basically reprising her role as Christine. I think Turin Bay is excellent in this film, even though he doesn't have a lot to do. And I think the production values go a long way in making the film more palatable, and it's nice to look at. It obviously doesn't have as much money and time thrown at it as the Phantom remake did, but while you can definitely tell this was the Phantom follow-up and it's joined at the hip with that film, there are some elements that make it preferable, and there are a few tinges of horror, and there are a few little suspense moments, and I think it's worth a watch, especially if you're already looking at the 43 Phantom. You really do owe it to yourself to check out the Climax. I can understand people not liking this film because it's not really a horror film and it does feel rather slow, but I think there's enough here to recommend it for fans of the genre, and of course Karloff fans or Phantom fans. And I like coming back to this every once in a while. And here on the Blu-ray presentation, we have this new 2K scan of the interpositive, so it is significantly improved over how I last saw this film on DVD and how it looked on standard def. So here, the Technicolor visuals do really come across more, although it would be nice to see this actually get the full 4K master treatment that the Phantom remake did. But here we at least have a significant improvement in the visuals, which of course are part of the big draw of this film and to help make it play much better. Then we come to the third and final film in this set, which is 1952's The Black Castle. And part of what I said before about how these films are broken up on the home video releases, this is a film that, like the Climax, is joined at the hip with the film that preceded it. So the Climax is very much a follow-up to the 1943 Phantom of the Opera remake, and The Black Castle is very much a follow-up to its sister film, 1951's The Strange Door. Both are black and white period adventure films and have swashbuckler adventure elements to them. Although the Strange Door is an adaptation of Robert Louis Stevenson and is much more period gothic, if you will, here in The Black Castle, this has elements of period gothic, but it is a full-on swashbuckler. And while both get labeled as horror films, and they do have horror tinges, I do agree with the commentary and some of the critical appraisal of these two films as not only joined at the hip and fascinating, far above average efforts from Universal that are films that really punch above their weight, but they're really, I think, where you should consider the end of the classic Universal horror films, because after this point, Universal pretty much transitioned entirely into science fiction, because The Black Castle itself is the last film Universal made in the genre, if you want to consider it that, before they transitioned over the next year with It Came from Outer Space, and the whole sort of Universal science fiction drive led by people like Jack Arnold, or the producer of this film, actually, William Allen, who had a hand in producing a lot of the big Universal science fiction hits. So it's interesting and fascinating to see Universal try something different that's still in the horror realm one last time before sort of throwing in the towel and going into science fiction land. So I think the Black Castle has to be seen with The Strange Door. I think they should be paired together, but at least you can now see both of them on Blu-ray nicely cleaned up with good new supplements. And I think these are some of the most underrated films in the whole Universal horror canon, and these are incredibly better than a lot of the more well-known horror films and horror sequels that Universal was cranking out as B films, because they very, very much punch above their weight. But here in The Black Castle, this is a full-on adventure swashbuckler. It stars Richard Green before he became immortalized as Robin Hood from the famous British television series of the 50s. But he's just a complete ball of wondrous energy here. He has ridiculous charm, and I love him in other films, but this, so far of all the films I've seen him in, this is probably my favorite performance of his. He's just an absolute delight, and this is a full-on swashbuckling experience, but beautifully photographed in black and white to have all of the trappings of it being also a period Gothic film. There's also a little tinge of the Green character essentially being a sort of secret agent of sorts. He goes to the titular Black Castle, where the villain played by a wonderful Stephen McNally, who's really menacing in a wonderful, nasty sort of way, and of course has a villainous eye patch that he wears. Green's character is trying to find out what happened to his two best friends who mysteriously died, and realizes that the villain is a man he's sought for years, who escaped his clutches in Africa. And there's a backstory where the McNally character was this terrible, dastardly villain in Africa and barely managed to escape Green and his forces, and they've been sort of chasing him ever since to make him pay for his crimes and atrocities. But there's a fun sort of spy story element, because Green is assuming a character that's more foppish, obviously, but also he is sort of being groomed and manipulated by the villain in a most dangerous game type way. There's even a hunting sequence where they're sort of testing Green's character, and you can see the parallels between the villain here and General Zara from the Most Dangerous Game, and that makes things more fun as well. There's also a romantic subplot that's actually pretty nicely developed with McNally's Count's character's wife, who's a countess played by Rita Corday. There's also a nice supporting cast of people in the castle and ne'er-do-wellers and scrupulous characters who are in the court of McNally's Count. We have the wonderful John Hoyt, who has a ridiculously menacing presence and also some nice sword fights, along with the great Michael Pate, who was also in The Strange Door. So he has really nice roles in both of these films that make you wish he had more to do. He's great in both of these films and really deserved a better career in Hollywood, even if it was just playing more wonderful, menacing sort of henchmen like this. He's a real standout in both of these. And then you've also, of course, got to have Boris Karloff in here, because this is somewhat marketed as a Karloff vehicle, but unfortunately his role here is very minor. He's the doctor character, and while he is his usual outstanding self in every scene, he doesn't get a lot to do, and it's a real disappointment that he's a more minor character, and also as a character he's on the weaker side, which is a little confusing because his first couple of scenes are really well done, and he's shown to be rather scheming and sort of operating his own agenda in the court of this castle. But if you thought Karloff's role was disappointing here, you have to look at what they gave poor Lon Chaney Jr. to do. He is essentially playing the mute servant who's also the brute character, and while he's great in every scene and is a physical presence, it's just really sad to see what Chaney Jr. was reduced to doing, and this is really the end of his time at Universal. But with that being said, he is great in every scene and gives across this sense of menace, and if you want to look at it in a certain way, because he's walking around kind of stooped over and he doesn't really have he doesn't have any dialogue, and he's making these grunts and he's conveying so much expression through his face, you can look at it as, obviously still being a slight echo of his performance as Lenny and of Mice and Men, but I kind of like to look at it as a sort of maybe a little tinge of what he might have done if he had gotten the chance to play Quasimodo, as he wanted to do when Hunchback of Notre Dame was going to get remade at RKO, but he just didn't get the chance to do that. So that's how I try to look at this, to at least give it a little bit more positivity, because otherwise it's just really sad to see Lon Chaney Jr. reduced to just playing this mute servant role and not having anything to do other than being the heavy. It's the type of role he would have played in his early career days when he was a jobbing actor, just only able to play bit parts and heavies. But you do have all of these great names in this film that does add not only marquee value, but it adds spice and flavor, and this is an incredibly well-made film. It's a total surprise the first time you see it. It's a full-on period swashbuckler with some tinges of gothic quality and some slight horror tinges, if you want to call it that, but it is not a horror film. It also does have a bookend structure, which is seemingly lifted right out of Romeo and Juliet. We have the whole people taking a poison to make them appear dead, which of course is always a terrible idea, and of course in this film does not work out very well, but it's used as a sort of as bookends, and I don't really think the film needs it. It's fine, but because we have these bookends, it does make the ending a little bit perfunctory, which is unfortunate. I think that does mar the film's effectiveness just a little bit. You want that classical big final showdown epic sword fight, and you don't really get that here. So here, I think the disappointing qualities are the ending does feel perfunctory and a little bit rushed. You've got both Karloff and Lon Chaney Jr. not being given very much to do, and it's very disappointing, but at least they are still good in their individual moments. But it's the other elements that really strive to make up for that. The production design is fascinating because here you have the art designer, Nathan Juran, turning director for the first time, and he does a remarkable job. The film was supposed to have been directed by Joseph Pevney, who directed The Strange Door. This was supposed to be a follow-up to that film, obviously. That's why I say they're joined at the hip. And even if you didn't know that, you could just see them visually, and they're very much two of a kind. But Pevney wanted some script changes, and apparently Universal said no, and so Pevney pretty much walked off the picture, and it was Juran, the art director, who stepped up to direct, and again, he does a really remarkable job. This is a very visual film. There are really striking camera setups throughout, particularly one where the camera's inside of the fireplace looking out at the villain and henchman in, at least trying for some sense of deep focus. There's so many striking visuals that make the castle feel more vivid. It's a very visually striking film, and enhanced further because it's shot in black and white with a good amount of production value to it. It's obviously not a big A-feature costume picture, but it has a lot of the pluses of being that without getting bogged down in a big runtime, and it's still a solid adventure film, and you do get some good sword fights, and Richard Green is ridiculously charming, and Stephen McNally is wonderfully villainous, and on top of that, it has great charm, it has echoes of The Most Dangerous Game, and this is the kind of film where the villain can have not only a torture dungeon in his castle, but also a secret room that the hero and heroine happen to open, and of course, it's a crocodile pit, which is just absolutely baffling to find in an old European castle. It's never explained how the villain got a bunch of crocodiles and a whole lagoon inside of this inner chamber of his castle torture dungeon, but it's beautiful, and you don't care about the logistics because the idea itself is phenomenal and seems ripped right out of a serial adventure story. So This is a film where you've got Richard Green being ridiculously dashing, wonderful villainy, wonderful period details, and wonderful gothic flavor, but also great sword fights and a crocodile pit inside a torture dungeon of a castle where Boris Karloff and Lon Chaney Jr. are skulking around. So, what's not to love? No, it's not a perfect film, but good gosh, this is a hidden gem along with The Strange Door. I think both are a perfect double feature. They really have to be looked at together, but this is even more of an adventure film than The Strange Door was, and it's an absolute delight and one of the best films that is linked to Universal Horror that Universal produced. And it's a damn shame they didn't continue with these and that they only made these two films at the tail end of really what represents the end of Universal Horror as we know it before science fiction. So basically, you go from Dracula in 1931 all the way up to here in the Black Castle in 1952. And that's really the bulk and the real core and the real bookends of what is the true Universal Horror canon. And at least they did go out on a high note because this is an incredibly well-made film. To move on to the picture quality, the Black Castle is here in a 2K scan of fine-grained elements like what we saw in Night Key. It is a dramatic improvement over DVD presentations of the past that I've seen, particularly in the photography and the black levels, and the overall level of detail is far better. You do have to expect some general wear. There are some scratches and little lines that start to poke through in various areas. Nothing major, but some inherent wear, a little bit of frame movement here and there, but again, nothing particularly major. Of course, the uptick in visuals also makes it quite obvious when, amusingly, there are some sets and things reused from past Universal films and even some stock footage. Literally, the opening title shot, it shows this castle, and it seems to be the castle from Ghost of Frankenstein. And that goes into the music, too, which does reuse cues from The Wolfman and other Universal films, as do most Universal horror or horror-adjacent films, because Universal was known for reusing cues all the time. So you will notice some Wolfman music for sure here. To move on to the audio, this is where I think you've got more to be concerned about. We do have the original mono mix in lossless quality, but there is a lot of inherent limitations to the source they were using. There's quite a bit of hiss throughout. They do seem to have tried to do some noise reduction on it, but there's a lot of distortion throughout this track. It is very noticeable. It is a bit distracting. It's been a long time since I've seen the DVD of this, so I can't remember exactly if that was there, but there is consistent distortion that comes and goes throughout, and there's a lot of harshness to the dialogue, and I think they just had to work from a more compromised audio source for this. So I wish the audio was better, but I think it's limited due to the source they had to work from. But do expect a lot of ticks and pops throughout, a lot of harshness in the dialogue, some bursts of hiss, but also quite a bit of distortion. And again, the harshness on the dialogue is almost consistent throughout the feature, and you eventually get used to it, but it's just a shame that apparently that's the state of the audio elements that are available. Then to move on to the supplements, we again have a new commentary, this time by the wonderful team of Kim Newman and Stephen Jones, who are no strangers to classic horror fans. They've done many fantastic double-act commentaries like this, so this is pretty much more of the same. They have a wonderful, lively discussion of the film, its connections to The Strange Door, it's the story of its production, the wonderful above-average qualities of this film, the effectiveness of the great cast, the wonderful photography, what Nathan Jordan brought to this film from being an art director, and how this does represent really what is the end of traditional Universal horror, because after this they went into science fiction territory. So it's a great track, it's a must listen, and very engaging like all their tracks, and loaded with information, and they both really love this film and The Strange Door, and that's nice to hear, because both of these films are real surprises when you come to them for the first time, because there's nothing else quite like them in the Universal horror canon. And again, it's at least great that the Universal horror canon went out on a high note with these two films. We also have a stills gallery with lovely production stills, poster images, lobby cards, and again, nice to see VHS artwork from the home video releases. But unfortunately, there is no trailer included here, because I guess there's not one that survives, unfortunately. Now to move on to the packaging and artwork, we have this beautiful usage of original imagery in this gorgeous slipcover featuring Karloff and the Universal Terror Collection, bringing together these three films. This is done in the same type of design as the other Eureka releases, so they look lovely together on the shelf. In terms of all of their Universal Horror releases, we have the list of supplements on the back. And then once you take the slipcover off, we have the case itself, where on all of these, Eureka does include original poster imagery for each film, in addition to the credits on the back. And then you simply open the case to find the reversible artwork for the other films, and of course the wonderful disc labels as well, and there is the Black Castle as well. We get a lovely new booklet with lovely artwork and imagery from all three films. This is done in the same nice style as other Eureka booklets, and this has 3 new essays for each film, all by Stephen Jacobs, who talks about each film in detail, about the production, and also its place in Karloff's career, because Karloff is the focus of this set, as he is for a lot of these different releases, since, of course, he is the key star figure in Universal Horror. But it's nice to get a write-up on each of the films in the booklet, and then, of course, we also get the Eureka technical information at the end. So those are my overall thoughts on the Eureka Region B release of the Universal Terror Collection, which brings us beautiful new presentations of the wonderfully fun Night Key, the really interesting The Climax, and the absolute gem of the Black Castle, which is technically the last Universal horror film. All the new extras are really wonderful, and the packaging, artwork, and booklet are wonderful as well and very substantial. So unfortunately, while you do lose out on the extras of the Shout Factory presentations of these films, I do think this is the superior home video presentation, at least in comparing the two Blu-rays, because the overall efforts here, I think, are a bit more substantial, and these films are paired together because they sort of have a similar theme of being Universal horror outliers and all feature the legendary Boris Karloff. While I think The Climax is an interesting film and still a must for Universal horror and Karloff fans, the real draw here are the wonderful gems of Night Key and The Black Castle especially. Those two films I would recommend to anyone, and I absolutely adore both of them. Even though I still really like The Climax for different reasons. It is obviously the least of these three, so I do think you get your money's worth certainly with this set, and if you've gotten and enjoyed any of Eureka's other Universal horror releases, then this is a must as well. I do believe this is still one of their limited editions and how they consider it, so once they eliminate the limited version, I think they'll just reissue this without the slipcover, but when you can get these while they're still in print, it's definitely the way to go, and all of their classic horror releases have been really impressive and are usually better than the releases of the same masters here in the US, as I think here you have on this compared to the Shout Factory volumes. So as always, I hope my babblings about the world of Universal horror and adjacent films and physical media has been at least somewhat fun and informative. Please do check out some of these Eureka releases if you haven't. Even if you have the Shout Factory collections, there is so much to recommend about these Eureka releases, and you could definitely tell that some time and quality and some care went into packaging these films and making these theme release sets, and they are better encoded and better made than the Shout and Kino releases of these films usually, even though you lose out on the exclusive extras of the US versions. I think the Eureka versions are the way to go, and hopefully they continue with these and finish off releasing the other Universal horror films that the studio has done new masters of. So please do check out these Eureka releases. They are Region B, but region-free capability is now a lot easier than it used to be. You can get a region-free player for usually pretty cheap now, or some UHD players will have region workarounds. So it's easier to do now, and these are also quite inexpensive, especially when you can catch them on sale, and I think they're absolute musts for any classic horror fan. So, as always, please do keep supporting both studio and boutique labels by buying films on disc to help keep both physical media and film culture alive. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.